bolted, like, for instance, Utah State,
Right.
what I'm sure Loxley's going to hang around with Alabama, but that didn't work so well with Kiffin a couple years ago, and he got tossed after the semifinal. And, this coaching carousel will keep moving. Obviously, Ohio State yesterday, and which was obviously we all saw that one coming.
Absolutely, man.
And now the new trend, Kiev, is all these guys not playing in bowl games, which I get it in some respects. Like if I'm Deebo Samuel in South Carolina and they go 7-5, I mean, I get Deebo Samuel skipping the bowl game. But, if you're in a New Year's Six or a playoff, I don't really get it unless you are just from seriously financial, background where it's just, I'm the key to about 20 people's, having food on the table the next few years, which I think kind of is the case with LSU's Greedy Williams, which is why he's going to skip the bowl. And certainly I can respect that. But I prefer it to be like Devin White, LSU, the linebacker who is going to play the bowl regardless.
Yeah, man. Well, you even had Nick Bosa quit before the season even ended for the draft. So, he's projected top 3, I'm guessing still. And, I can understand that why, but there's also insurance policies out there that are offered for these types of situations. Now, you're right. Like you said, like if you're a skill position where an ACL would affect your play a lot more than, possibly a trench guy, then I can understand it if you're not in a New Year's Bowl. But it's unfortunate for the viewers to have to go through this, especially if it's one of your teams. But I guess from a handicapping standpoint, it might be a little bit of an advantage because public perception sometimes does not factor in those injuries, and you might be able to get a good line right before the game or right when the news breaks.
Kiev, do you want me to just go down to the list I've got of the 9 guys that have definitely said they're not playing?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get right into our college. Are some thoughts on the college bowls there? And hey, you got a list of guys. That's great. Our listeners would love to hear that. Let's go ahead and start off with that.
All right. Well, Iowa tight end Noah Fant, Michigan defensive end Rashawn Gary. So we Gators appreciate that. Arizona State. Wide receiver and return guy, N'Keal Harry, Ed Oliver. I mentioned Greedy Williams, LSU. I mentioned Deebo Samuel, South Carolina. Jermaine Pratt of North Carolina State. And also keep an eye on Caden Smith, tight end at Stanford. He missed the last 2 games with a foot injury. And I can't say all that I know, but you could probably get the hint. I don't think he'll be playing in the bowl game.
Oh, man. And some big players there. N'Keal Harry, almost seems like the biggest one to the line there, I would almost think, right? There's probably a big drop-off from him to the next wide receiver. He was the biggest target for ASU. And so, he's one of the ones I'd be worried about myself. Who do you think is the most impactful ones compared to the next guy coming up?
Well, I mean, I agree with you on Harry. I mean, that's big. I don't think Fant is that big a deal because their other tight end, is really good. Deebo Samuel, that's a pretty big deal for South Carolina. And, Brian Edwards, not me, spelled with a Y, the other big time receiver for South Carolina. I would guess, now I haven't gone to look at Kuiper's wide receiver rankings, but I would imagine he's kind of on the fence of maybe turning pro. So maybe, if Bentley were to not have Deebo and Edwards, that would be, enormous and a big boost for Virginia. Right. In that game, because remember South Carolina's got all kind of injuries on the defensive side anyway. They actually had to move A.J. Turner, one of their 3 veteran running backs. They had to move him to nickelback last week against Akron because they had like 5 safeties who were out. So, but yeah, they're all pretty important. But N'Keal Harry is probably him and Greedy Williams and Deebo are probably the biggest ones. And while just props to Herm Edwards. ASU had a really good year, and they were even better for ATS purposes. I mean, I don't think anybody let me go to their page. I don't think anybody ran away from them all season long. I thought Herm Edwards, who took a lot of or ASU took a lot of criticism for hiring him. I thought he did a terrific job this year.
Absolutely. I would almost say close to coach of the year, I mean, bringing that program back, he's got to be in the conversation there. Totally agree with you. Deebo Samuel, of course, he's such a big, impactful player there. I guess with Gary, with Michigan, it makes sense, but I remember Gary was missing some of their games, and the next guy standing, don't know his name, he did pretty good, and that's just because of Michigan, their name, and their recruiting. So I don't know if there's much of a drop-off between Gary and that next guy, but when it comes to those types of skill positions, then you definitely you wonder, and I don't know if anything's else is gonna pop out. I would imagine that there would be a quarterback or two that doesn't want to chance it, but it looks like Drew Lott or Missouri's quarterback is going to play his game. Correct?
Yeah, I mean that's what I've heard, and he needs to. I mean, he needs to cement his status with a quality performance in my mind, because I've seen him kind of all over the place in mock drafts. I've seen him as late as like mid to late third round. And then, obviously, I know at one point Kuiper had him as a first rounder. I'm not I can't say that for certain on his last big board, which I did look at about a week or so ago, but I can't specifically recall.
All right, my man. Well, that's cool. Great information right there. If you're going to put some money on these games, remember who is going to be missing from those teams. And let's move into coaches then, my man. One of your ex-coaches at Florida, the biggest news possibly that came out this week, it wasn't unexpected whatsoever. Urban Meyer says he is retiring, and I think the age is, 54? And I've heard some medical issues. I've heard many things. Do you think he's done coaching in college football or even in general?
I do not. Now, I actually broke the story on December 26th of 2009 when I found out from a really good source that when the Gators got to New Orleans that night, they were going for the Sugar Bowl after they'd lost to Alabama 32-13 in the SEC championship, and they were playing unbeaten Cincinnati. And I got word that he was going to announce in a team meeting at 6 p.m. that night after they landed that he was quitting. So I had that on VegasInsider.com's homepage, and that was like right when I was first getting into Twitter. I think I had been on Twitter maybe 3 or 4 months. And I broke that story like 5-6 hours before everybody else. And then he changed his mind the next day, and then he sleepwalked through an entire season, 8-5, and then he quit again for the second time in 347 days. And I wrote that they, if I was Foley, the former AD at Florida, who's another goofball, I wrote that if I were him, there'd be no reason for, slaps on the back and farewell and thanks for the effort, coach, going into a meaningless bowl game with Penn State. I said his office would be cleared out if I was the guy in charge. And then Jeremy Foley, not only let him coach the bowl game, but like signed him to a contract, staying on with the school in some sort of mentoring advisory type role, paid him $1 million to do so. Okay. And then 2 minutes later, after he had talked about going to high school volleyball games and family first and all this BS. And no, I'm not saying it is BS. Him doing it was BS, of course. And 2 months later, he takes a job with ESPN, and he's traveling all across the country, going to everybody's spring practice. And after he had quit on Florida the second time, Tressel and the tattoo story broke 2-3 weeks later. And then when he's doing the ESPN thing, everybody knew he was just going to take the Ohio State job. Now, this time around, I don't know what he's got in store for his future, but I know why he quit. And he quit because you could see it on his face at that press conference, that shit show of a press conference in August. He quit because he was irate, livid, that Ohio State, in his mind, would have the audacity to suspend him. And he's been pissed ever since. And just so he could, I mean, I'm so familiar with this guy's nonsense theatrics. I mean, how many times had we heard until Kiev, like maybe a month ago, maybe 5 weeks ago? How many times had we heard he had the surgery in 2014 with the brain cyst and all that? All right, we hadn't heard it once. And we know he's had this brain cyst. We've known this since like 07, 08. It was in a Sports Illustrated article when he was with the Gators that he had that thing. But we hadn't heard one thing about him having that surgery in 2014 until the last 4 or 5 weeks. And that another nonsensical press conference yesterday where Gene Smith is lauding him like he's the Pope when we all know, Gene, he threw you under the bus and tried to get you fired in August. I mean, it's just hilarious. The just nonsense from this guy. I don't know what his future holds, but if anybody thinks he quit for any other reason than he was humiliated and livid and pissed that they didn't stand by him and they suspended him, then you just don't know Urban Meyer. And there you go.
Well, with all the experience you had with him at Florida, it's definitely not hard not to listen to what you have to say about that. Gene Smith, he's as dirty as Meyer is, if not worse, in my opinion. I think those guys are kind of like one of those that say, I don't want to know the bad stuff going on, but I want you to do the bad stuff, aka my boosters, to make sure we have a great football team. I kind of look at him like that. I never want to know a detail, but I want it. It's got to happen type deal. And, you can just pile on Jim Delaney, the head of the Big Ten, as well, to these groups of morons. I think, I'm not a big fan of him.
I agree.
And he's done a terrible job for the Big Ten. Big Ten hasn't had a good representative. There's been some poor officiated games. You can even go back to the Duke-Wisconsin game of a couple years back. I'm still quite bitter myself about that. But, just a complete mess at Ohio State. And I think their next guy, Day, I don't know a ton. I know that he had some Chip Kelly experience, and I think he was a big part of the success at Ohio State in their offense. So, they might have lucked out again getting to keep that guy. I don't know. But, we'll see how that turns out into fruition. The other major one was Wells, I think, from Utah State. He's gone there, and you saw that spread drop a little bit from +11 against North Texas down to 9, and I think I have to agree with that line move. Because I thought that coach is a pretty big part to that winning football team, right?
Yeah, no, Wells did a terrific job at Utah State, and in fact, I mean, they might be the biggest, surprise in the country and one of the better feel-good stories this year. 10-2, they lose a heartbreaker at Boise State, where rarely anybody wins. Well, I say that, I guess Fresno and San Diego State did this year, but and they were in a tie game with Michigan State late fourth quarter and lost by 7. And didn't they go 8 straight weeks where they not only covered and hit the over, if I'm not mistaken? So, yeah, Wells was a good get for Texas Tech, and he had a nice run at Utah State for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So Texas Tech, good thing. They're going to bring in another high-powered offense-type guy. And now that, he's also got a defensive mind. You saw their defense at Utah State. They were extremely good. So Texas Tech on the up there. I think that was a great hire myself. But for the sake of time, my man, we have a lot to cover. Let's move into a couple of these games. Why don't we start out with this weekend's game for everybody, since it's fresh on our minds. The Army-Navy game, the battle of the triple option. Do you have any thoughts on this spread? Army laying 7 points. Pretty high for this type of game.
Yeah, I think it's Army or pass. I think Navy is one of the nation's biggest disappointments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are. They are. They have a. I mean, where they win 3 games